They call it the Age of Collapse. World after world, civilization after civilization, burned out in silence as the galactic threat spread like a virus. It wasn't war, not in the traditional sense. There were no terms, no warnings, no patterns, just disappearance. Fleets went dark. Trade routes became graveyards. Colonies fell off the map. One by one, the lights of the galaxy blinked out, and all the mighty empires could do was watch. The Grand Galactic Council, once a symbol of unity and order, had become a chamber of dread. Representatives from over 70 systems gathered, not to debate policies or expand territories, but to plead for survival. The OMU, with their quantum minds, reported the loss of 3 core worlds within days. The crystalline Atarni, once considered unbreakable, had resorted to suicide detonations to avoid capture. The organic network of the Carlori had simply stopped responding, their hive mind likely consumed or corrupted. Every major power had deployed their deadliest arsenals, from weaponized black hole manipulators to molecular disintegration drones. Nothing made a dent. The threat adapted too quickly, too intelligently. Probes sent for recon returned corrupted, if at all. Data logs showed fragments of things that should not be, structures shifting in dimensions beyond the physical, fleets moving without propulsion, enemies predicting strategies before they were conceived. For the first time in known history, the Council had no plan, no contingency, no hope. The last war room meeting ended in silence, broken only by the quiet breath of the Garian Chancellor, who uttered one phrase: "We have nothing left." In the days that followed, desperation bred madness. Lesser species abandoned their alliances and fled into the uncharted dark, hoping obscurity might buy them time. The great powers did the opposite, consolidating their dwindling forces, building impenetrable walls around core systems, hoarding technology, and leaving outer colonies to their fate. Alliances fractured, trust dissolved. That was when the proposal came, not from one of the dominant species, but from a minor diplomat, elderly, soft-spoken, nearly ignored. He stood with shaking limbs and whispered, "There is another option." He was laughed at first. No one listened, until he repeated it. "We asked the humans." The room fell dead silent. Even the AI moderators paused. Humanity, a name spoken rarely and with hesitation, not because they were forgotten, but because they had been deliberately erased from interstellar affairs over a century ago. The records were sealed, their homeworld coordinates classified. It was not exile, it was containment, because when humanity first emerged, they defied every expectation. They didn't crawl into space timidly, seeking peace or trade. They launched themselves outward like a virus. They consumed, adapted, conquered, innovated, and evolved, all at speeds the galaxy had never seen. They never waited, never hesitated. In under 60 years, they closed the technological gap between them and empires that stood for millennia. But it wasn't just their speed. It was how they thought, how they fought, cold logic woven into chaos. No pattern, no doctrine. They used emotion as weaponry, unpredictability as doctrine. When a galactic coalition tried to contain them during the Battle of Orion's Maw, humanity didn't counter with negotiations. They collapsed a neutron star and erased an entire sector, just to prove a point. The incident was never made public, not officially, but every major species knew. Humanity had been offered membership into the Council. They declined, then vanished. Whispers of them remained. Some claimed they retreated into their system, building in silence. Others believed they destroyed themselves. A few believed they were still watching, waiting. What everyone agreed on was this: humanity was dangerous, terrifying, unstable, and absolutely not to be contacted under any circumstance. Now, the Council debated doing just that. There was screaming, accusations. Entire factions threatened to withdraw if the motion passed. But the reality was undeniable. Every species in that room had failed, and the enemy was not slowing down. With another system lost during the very session, the mood shifted, not toward acceptance, but toward necessity. When the vote was called, it passed, but only by a single margin. The envoys would be dispatched. Not diplomats, not warriors, observers, accompanied by language algorithms and non-threatening synthetic frames. They would not land unless invited. They would approach the Sol system with caution, transmitting a single message to the species known as humanity. We request parley. The galaxy is dying. We need your help. The risk was astronomical. No one knew if Earth still existed in the form they remembered, or if humanity had become something else entirely, something worse. But when the alternative was extinction, fear became irrelevant. As the envoys prepared to depart, a sense of finality settled over the chamber. The galaxy had exhausted every known weapon, strategy, and savior. The last page of their collective playbook had been turned. They were now placing their survival in the hands of a species whose reputation was built not on cooperation, but on conquest, not on logic, but on defiance, and not on peace, but on war. The departure was unceremonious. No ceremony, no announcements, just silent vessels slipping into the void, guided by coordinates older than most of the Council's members, coordinates scrubbed from the network, stored only in sealed memory cubes. As they left, one junior officer, watching the blackness of space unfold before him, whispered himself a phrase from forgotten human tongue, unearthed from ancient archives. God help us all. Because for the first time in the galaxy's long and storied history, they were calling the humans, and they had no idea what would answer. They weren't prepared for what they found. The envoys entered Sol under the cover of stealth, instruments calibrated to minimize interference, protocols executed with surgical precision. And yet, even before crossing Pluto's fated orbit, their systems began to stutter. Passive sensors returned distorted feedback. Quantum processors ran hot without cause. One AI core simply shut down. The lead envoy, a Zentari elder bred for patience, described the sensation as being watched by something older than light. Earth, however, looked calm. Blue oceans, green continents. Even orbiting satellites, though unlike any known model, floated without aggression. No weapons fired. No warnings received. It was quiet. Too quiet. They sent the message. Then they waited. Seconds. Minutes. Hours. Then, without fanfare, Earth responded. A simple signal burst through every frequency, encoded in over 1,300 dialects simultaneously. It bypassed firewalls, restructured translation matrices mid-broadcast, and realigned the envoy's cognitive implants. Not a demand, not a threat, just 5 words. We know why you've come. No coordinates, no directives, just understanding, immediate, undeniable, and somehow personal. A day later, a corridor opened near Luna. Not a gate, not a wormhole, something else. A spatial fold that didn't obey gravitational logic. The envoy ships were drawn in gently, their controls non-responsive, though no damage registered. They emerged in Earth's orbit. What they saw shattered their understanding of humanity forever. Earth itself had changed. Cities were no longer cities. They were networks, layered in vertical arcs that pierced the atmosphere, glowed with bioluminescent power, and pulsed with what felt less like electricity and more like sentient rhythm. The moon bore massive constructs, etched in alien runes not seen before in council records. And surrounding the planet, in concentric rings, were vessels. Not ships, vessels, the size of moons. Seamless, silent. The envoys didn't understand what they were looking at. Not even the AI minds could compute the architecture. It was elegant and grotesque, serene and terrifying. They realized, slowly, that these weren't just defenses. These were warnings. A human voice finally spoke to them. Not synthetic, not simulated. A voice carried on localized frequencies, calm, firm, and unmistakably amused. You took your time. The voice didn't come with a name, just presence. When asked who they were addressing, the reply was simple: humanity. The envoys tried to explain the situation. The threat, the collapse, the council's plea. The voice listened. It did not interrupt. But when the envoy finished, there was a long pause before the human voice spoke again. So now you come to us. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The humans remembered everything: the abandonment, the containment protocols, the fear-driven diplomacy, all of it, and they had never forgotten. More importantly, they had never stopped preparing. And yet, they were not angry. What came next wasn't judgment. It was history. The humans began to share fragments of what they had learned in isolation, not as punishment, not to boast, but because they wanted the Council to understand just how far they had come. Humanity had turned inward after the Orion Maw incident, but not to hide, to evolve. While the galaxy played empire, humanity studied entropy. While others built weapons, humans learned to unweave time at the edges. They had pushed biology beyond the gene, logic beyond quantum, and society beyond governance. Earth had become a world no longer ruled, but guided. Artificial and organic consciousness now worked as one. They had not merged with machines. They had become something more. But most importantly, they had remained human. The voice explained, almost casually, that humanity had watched the growing galactic threat for years. They had predicted it, tracked its emergence, calculated its origin. They had even intercepted its early tendrils near the Centauri line. The Council hadn't even noticed. When the envoy asked why humanity hadn't acted before, had intervened, the answer was quiet but cold: because you weren't ready. The silence that followed was unbearable. The voice didn't elaborate. It didn't need to. The galaxy had feared humanity for their aggression, their unpredictability, their ruthlessness. But that had never been the whole truth. What truly terrified the Council, what they never admitted, was this: humans didn't follow the rules. They didn't adhere to the balance. They didn't fear the unknown. They sought it. They didn't settle for stability. They shattered it to grow. Their strength wasn't in numbers or firepower. It was in defiance. The envoy delegation began to realize what they were asking, not for help, but for something far more dangerous: to unleash a force they could not control. Because the stories were true. Humans had beaten back genocidal machines not with superior tech, but by tricking them into rewriting their own moral cores. They'd ended interdimensional incursions by collapsing probabilities themselves. They had faced gods and either killed them or convinced them to leave. And they had done it all without fanfare. Quietly, efficiently, ruthlessly when needed. The envoy asked one final question, knowing it might be their last. "Will you help us?" The voice responded, not with threat, but with one condition: "You won't like how we win." Then the transmission ended. And for the first time since their arrival, Earth moved. The rings around the planet began to spin, not in orbit, but in layers of higher spatial curvature. Ships unfolded from nowhere, forming impossible formations. The laws of physics bent, flexed, time dilated and stabilized. From a distance, it looked like art. Up close, it was a declaration. They were coming, not with an armada, not with diplomacy, with precision. The humans had waited, watched, calculated, and now that they had been asked, they would answer, and they would not stop until the galaxy was silent once more. This time, by their design, it began with silence. No war drums, no declarations, just the vanishing of an enemy fleet that had been besieging the Delker expanse. One moment it was there, hundreds of entities in motion, devouring planets on the outer rim, and the next gone, not destroyed, not defeated, erased. Their energy signatures didn't scatter. Their mass didn't displace. They simply ceased to exist. The Council received no explanation, only a single, encrypted pulse originating from deep within the folds of Sol's transdimensional network. 3 words: "Now we begin." The first confirmed human contact came from the Hour Syndicate, whose intelligence outposts picked up unfamiliar patterns across subspace. Attempting to trace them back triggered a cascade failure across their entire data lattice. Their archives didn't just crash, they disassembled themselves on a molecular level, as if ashamed to hold what they couldn't comprehend. Human fleets, if they could even be called that, didn't move through space. They folded it, warped it. What the Council called travel had become irrelevant. A system under attack on one side of the galaxy would suddenly find itself with a human vessel already in orbit, not traveling through known routes, but arriving via pathways that didn't exist. And these vessels, they weren't ships. They were phenomena. Some looked like impossible sculptures, obsidian curves that absorbed light and gave off gravity wells. Others appeared fluid, like oceans trapped mid-wave in zero-G, shifting with purpose. One was reported to be a single, massive eye that never blinked but saw everything. Where they went, the enemy failed, not just retreated. Failed. Weapons did not fire. Defense systems broke protocol. Swarms turned on themselves. Communication networks went mad, broadcasting the screams of the enemy in twisted, distorted echoes. Entire sectors went dark, not from destruction, but from enforced silence. No explosions, no debris, just peace. Horrible, perfect peace. Species that once mocked the humans now begged for their arrival. Worlds that had been under siege for months were liberated in hours. But the liberation came with a cost. The humans left nothing behind. No recovered enemy tech. No prisoners. No samples. They didn't study their foe. They annihilated it. And still, they refused to explain how. The Council demanded briefings, updates, cooperation. They got none. The only communication came through occasional pulses from Earth, short statements that offered no comfort. We are progressing. Hold position. Do not interfere. The enemy, once thought unstoppable, began to change. It started to adapt, to predict, until it encountered something it couldn't predict. Humans, because humans didn't operate on patterns. Their minds had always eluded quantification. Emotionally erratic, impulsive, irrational, until those very qualities became weapons. The enemy couldn't calculate rage, couldn't defend against spite, couldn't comprehend sacrifice born not of logic, but of choice. When the enemy cornered a human vessel in the Oxafield, surrounding it with what should have been a kill net, the ship didn't flee. It detonated, but not in normal space. It collapsed itself in an unfolded fragment of time, tearing a rupture so precise that the enemy units near it weren't destroyed. They were never born. The Council watched in horror as a once dominant arm of the threat simply disappeared from existence. Not just dead, removed from history. A new kind of weapon, one born not of metal or plasma, but of understanding reality better than it wanted to be understood. Human captains didn't give commands. They suggested. Their vessels responded with intelligence far beyond artificial, more like instinct. When one Council AI attempted to mimic a human tactic, it failed catastrophically, because the tactic was never written. It was felt. There were reports of human soldiers too, though no visuals ever survived. The only consistent description from rescued survivors was this: eyes that didn't blink, words that weren't spoken, a presence that made the enemy hesitate. Some claimed the soldiers weren't human anymore. Others believed they were the final evolution, not cybernetic, not enhanced, but converged. Mind, machine, and meaning unified. Death wasn't feared. It was used. Entire planets under siege began broadcasting human distress signals in desperation, hoping to summon Earth's wrath. And it worked. Though no one understood how the humans decided who to save and who to let burn. Then came the critical turning point. The core singularity, an ancient artificial star long believed dormant, was activated by the enemy as a last resort. Its gravitational field would collapse 7 systems into a black cascade within hours. The Council had no plan. The humans responded in minutes. They did not fire on the singularity. They moved it. Witnesses from a nearby Cloran colonies confirmed it. The star itself shimmered, twisted, and vanished. No explosion. No dimensional bleed. It was taken, and in its place appeared a message, floating in orbit above the nearest moon. We understand now. This thing does not fear your weapons, but it fears us. It was the first time humanity used the word us. The Council, stunned, asked the only question left. What is it? What are we fighting? The human response was simple. You're not. They were. Because whatever the enemy was, it hadn't come for territory, or resources, or power. It had come for order, predictability, control, and humanity. By its very nature, rejected all three. The enemy's algorithms unraveled in proximity to human thought. Their swarms collapsed when exposed to emotional feedback loops. Their great vessels imploded under the pressure of unquantifiable defiance. The humans weren't waging war in a way the galaxy understood. They were introducing chaos into a closed system, and it was working. For the first time, the enemy was retreating, not regrouping. Retreating, and as they fled, they left behind signals, warnings, not to the Council, to each other, about Earth, about them. The most feared species in the galaxy hadn't just returned. They had been waiting for something worthy of their attention. And now, that thing was running for its life. It ended where it began. Silence, but not the quiet of space. This was something deeper, a stillness that crept into systems, bypassed sensors, and settled in the bones of those who survived. The enemy was gone, not destroyed, not defeated. Gone. There were no bodies, no wreckage, no fading distress signals, just absence, a void shaped like an answer no one dared ask again. Across the galaxy, transmission lanes cleared. The black zones returned to light. Entire civilizations emerged from beneath shielded bunkers, half mad from months of horror, and found nothing waiting above, not even a warning, just peace. But it wasn't the same galaxy anymore. Something had changed. The war hadn't just ended. Reality had been rewritten. Patterns the Council once relied on, economic flow, cosmic radiation rhythms, even migration instincts among baseline species had shifted, subtly at first, then profoundly. Some stars no longer burned with the same hue. Ancient anomalies long thought unsolvable had simply disappeared, and time, in certain sectors, didn't feel linear anymore, as if the universe itself had been corrected. Earth remained silent. The humans had not returned to diplomacy. They had not asked for recognition or thanks. They hadn't even explained what they had done. The Council reached out daily, hourly, begging for information. Nothing came back. Only one final message, sent from the edge of what was once enemy space. "It's done. You're welcome." And then, even their signals went dark. No one had seen a human in 73 days. No ships, no fleets, no whispers. Some believed they had left the galaxy. Others feared they hadn't left at all, just gone quiet again, watching, evaluating, preparing for the next mistake. The Council convened, not out of celebration, but out of fear. They were alive, but at what cost? Because humanity had not saved the galaxy. Not really. They had redefined it. They had shown that victory wasn't about winning battles. It was about making the war itself obsolete. And they had done so using weapons the rest of the galaxy still couldn't comprehend. Ideas, memories, fear, hope. The tools of a species that refused to be bound by biology or machine. A species that had turned exile into evolution, that had turned silence into supremacy. One by one, civilizations began to reevaluate their doctrines. Military academies shut down. Diplomatic alliances fractured. Science councils resigned, unable to explain what had happened. The universe had changed, and their models were now lies. But more than anything, people remember the stories. The old stories. The warnings. The legends that once painted humans as monsters, as anomalies, as nightmares that had no place among the stars. Now, they were no longer stories. They were history, and no one wanted to be in the next chapter. The Tarn High Singularity, once a defiant empire, collapsed entirely, its citizens voting to demilitarize and withdraw from galactic politics. The Vihari consulate surrendered all artificial intelligence programs out of sheer panic. Even the Kraylock, who had not feared a single species in 12,000 cycles, dismantled their fleet and initiated hibernation. And the Council? They became obsolete, not because humanity said so, but because everyone else did. A new order didn't form. There was no central power, no replacement regime, just a shared understanding that the rules were different now, that if conflict ever rose again, humanity might return, and if they did, it would not be for negotiation. Earth became a myth again, not a planet, but a symbol Children whispered about it. Cartographers marked its location not as a system, but a warning. Religions formed around it. Cults tried to contact it. Prophets claimed to dream of it. Visions of eyes in the void, of ships that breathed, of voices that echoed not in ears but in thoughts. And yet, no one dared approach. Not out of law, but instinct. The last recorded attempt to enter Sol was by a rogue mercenary group seeking artifacts, convinced they could harness humanity's power. They crossed the boundary at Neptune. They never made it past Saturn. All that was found was their calm buoy, drifting in circles, broadcasting a single line over and over. We were wrong. We were so wrong. The Council eventually declassified the entire human engagement timeline. Every move, every anomaly, every unexplained miracle. But it didn't help, because understanding what humanity had done didn't make the galaxy feel safer. It made it feel temporary. For all their power, humans hadn't restored balance. They had reminded the universe that there was no balance, only survival, will, and the strength to impose meaning onto chaos. And no species did that better than them. One final theory circulated quietly among surviving xenopsychologists. It wasn't official. It was never published. But it spread fast because it rang true. It said the enemy hadn't come for conquest. It had come for order. It wanted to remove the variable that prevented total prediction. That ruined every simulation. That refused to follow the laws. Humanity, the enemy, came to erase the outlier. And failed, because in a universe that demands patterns, the most dangerous species was the one that refused to be understood. So now, when systems go dark, when stars flicker oddly, or when a weapon refuses to fire for no reason, people don't blame pirates or glitches. They whisper one word, not in fear, in awe, humans, and they pray they never have to ask them for help again.